Back in 2022, Kodak released the Kodak Ektar H35, and that camera quickly became one of my favorites, and for me personally, has permanently replaced ever purchasing a disposable camera again. That camera soared in popularity, and in 2023, they released the sequel, the H35n. Now fast forward to today. It has now been 1 year since the release, with the anniversary of the release of this camera, and after my hundreds and hundreds of photos taken with this model, I wanted to give you my conclusive thoughts on if this camera is worth it, if you should just purchase the old one or just not bother at all. And if you're completely new to these types of cameras, let me quickly explain what it is that we're talking about. What makes these specific cameras so unique and special is the fact that they're half-frame cameras. The real estate of film that's being exposed to light is half as much as it usually is in 35mm film. And because it's only consuming half of that amount per picture, it means that you're able to double the amount of photos that you can typically get out of a normal roll. That feature alone makes the H35 and H35n immediately superior to a lot of cheap plastic point and shoots that are out on the market. And for those of you wondering, if you are taking up half of the amount of space of film, wouldn't that also cut the quality in half? And yes, you would be correct, but that doesn't make as big of a difference as you may expect, and when compared to disposable cameras, the H35 still produces sharper pictures. So we've established that this is already better than most of what's out there. So now what we need to cover is what makes the H35n different from its previous model. Is that upgrade worth it? And again, with all of my experience with this camera, I'm going to deep dive into all of those things. Let's first discuss what they changed. So there are a few tiny, minuscule quality of life changes around the camera, but those are not significant enough to change the entire camera, so I'm only going to focus on the things that actually matter here. First and foremost, the previous lens on the H35 was made of plastic, and in this upgraded version, this lens is made of glass. So I will say, objectively, the glass lens is sharper than the predecessor. However, that sharpness may not even matter depending on where you end up posting this, like on social media, for example. And if sharpness really is that important to you, you probably would be shooting on something else instead. While this lens is a better upgrade, that's not quite enough to convince me to move over to this camera instead. Now, the next feature that we need to talk about, in my opinion, is far more of a bigger headline than the glass lens, and that is the ability to shoot in bulb mode. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what this means, previously, every time you would take a picture, all of the settings were completely locked in with no control at all. Instead of the shutter speed being the locked in 1/100th of a second that it usually is, you now can expose something for longer simply by attaching a cable release, which is not included with the camera, by the way. So when you introduce the ability to do long exposures, that also means that you can't be moving the camera at all, meaning you're gonna need a tripod. So with that foresight, a tripod socket has been included in the bottom of the camera. You now can control how long you're exposing your images, which opens up a lot of possibilities with nighttime photography, doing light trails. That's where you can really get creative and explore some fun and different concepts in photography that you're not usually able to do with simple cameras like this. But there's a very important quirk that we need to talk about. So normally with film, after you've taken a shot, you wind to the next frame, aka advance to the next frame, and you're basically moving over the old shot in place of the new one. But when you plug in a cable release, this will actually override the locking mechanism that usually is required before you can take a shot. So what that means is if you're not careful, you can accidentally expose multiple times on one frame and ruin some shots that you cared about. Good thing I've never done that. But Kodak markets this as a feature allowing you to do multiple exposures. So I messed around with this multiple exposure mode, and I have a lot of thoughts. So like we said, we do need to be very conscious of when we're advancing, making sure that we're not doing multiple exposures too many times. The issue I ran into is pretty simple to understand, but also a very easy mistake to make. This movement is not as fast as I thought it would be. And so you actually end up exposing these images a lot longer than its default shutter speed. So I ended up with some blurry, extremely overexposed images, but hey, I was experimenting and just testing this out, and be conscious of what it is that you're shooting and for how long. Anyway, this was definitely a learning experience, but the fact that the camera could do this at all is pretty fun to mess with if you're willing to waste money, like me. Next is a feature that I don't like. And that is a star filter. Now, by flicking this switch over into the star mode, a plastic filter with a crosshatch shape will move across the lens. It kind of feels a little gimmicky and cheesy. It could be good in pretty niche scenarios, but hey, if you like inflicting your Instagram followers with what it's like to live with astigmatism, go nuts. Personally, I actually end up using this as a glorified lens cover whenever I throw it in my pocket. But don't forget to switch it back off before you take a picture. Ask me how I know. Now, let's talk about a bonus feature that wasn't even marketed by Kodak. This camera is completely mechanical, meaning you don't need any batteries to operate the thing. Simply put in a battery just for the flash and only the flash, but everything runs mechanically with mostly plastic inside. So that said, a lot of people assumed that most of the settings would be locked off. Interestingly enough, when you switch over the camera into the flash mode, it actually changes the aperture. So initially we all thought that the camera would be locked off at its f11 aperture, but when switching it over into the flash mode, it does open up to f8. This is a really interesting move because it adds one stop of light and a slightly more shallow depth of field. And in those situations that you're wanting that f8 aperture, but not the flash, you could just cover it up or just take out the battery because again, it's mechanical. It doesn't need the battery. So I thought this would be a game-changing feature simply because getting more manual controls by introducing this bulb mode and then also the ability to switch from f11 to f8. And then I was disappointed. I think in situations where you're dealing with low light and you don't have the flash available, yeah, that extra stop of light would be helpful. But in most situations, you will have the flash and it's gonna look better with the flash anyway. I've said this millions of times, but you absolutely need to be using the flash way more than you think you do. So to me, that extra stop of light is kind of already overshadowed by the fact that it has a flash. Okay, so then let's say you're desiring a shallower depth of field. In my opinion, moving from that f11 to f8 decreases too much of the sharpness, so I know that we're getting a shallower depth of field. However, the trade-off from the general sharpness of an f11 aperture just doesn't seem worth it to me. And you can see very clearly it's so much softer and muddy, not as contrasty, and it feels like it's actually suffering from the shallow depth of field. So even though this secret hidden feature that wasn't marketed isn't as life-changing as I was hoping it would be, the fact that it's still there is still nice. This camera somewhat bridges the gap between point and shoots and manual cameras. And that alone is really exciting for anyone who's even remotely interested in learning more about the photography side of things, such as settings, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, etc. It's great for the photography enthusiasts and would be a pretty good stepping stone for people like that. So we've already established that this camera is objectively an upgrade versus its predecessor, but is it worth the cost of that upgrade? Generally speaking, you can find the H35 somewhere around $50, but I can easily find it for around $40 pretty frequently. So really, this price jump could be considered more like $25. And what makes the pricing of the H35n really awkward, you enter the same pricing territory as a used SLR film camera, a real photography camera. So it kind of poses the question, would you rather have a cheap, low liability point and shoot with limited control, but made in 2024, or use a heavy metal camera with complete control over the settings, but it was made 50 years ago? So here's my final thoughts. As a baseline, I would say most people are looking for cheap film point and shoots simply to get vibey pictures with their friends, road trips, traveling, you name it. It just looks more aesthetically pleasing than using, say, your phone. Let's say all disposable cameras and refillable point and shoots are somewhere here. The H35 is much farther above that, an already huge upgrade, and the H35n is just a tiny little boop above that. So with either of these models, you're getting a great camera. The fact that it doubles the amount of pictures that you can get, that saves you a lot of money on film, is sharper than a disposable anyway, and gives you the flexibility of choosing what type of film stock you want to use, whether it's a quirky color, warmer tones, cooler tones, or even black and white. Those already make both of these great options. So here are the types of people that I think would appreciate these features and who would find that upgrade being worth it. If you felt the yearning for a little bit more, this would be for those photography enthusiasts wanting to dabble in photography, learn about long exposures, multiple exposures, and experiment just a little bit more with their camera. And I think those people already know who they are. If you already own the previous one, but it's fully satisfying your needs of just getting great vibey pictures of your memories and everyday life. Just stick with what you got. It's a great little camera. I love taking mine around. For me, both of these cameras will permanently replace ever using a disposable camera again, but if you do have an extra $15 to $25 lying around that you don't care about, and you never ever use these extra features, at a bare minimum, you're still objectively getting a sharper image. If you liked this video, like it. It actually makes a big difference. Comment down below if you have any questions or things you'd like me to cover. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.